Your shirt and my wall matches, Samina.
I realize that. Okay,
I could go switch hijabs real quick, Shakila.
We're in the blue family.
we are live and we are being recorded. So Bismillah. Gonna go ahead and get started. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for everybody who has joined this session today. And just gonna go ahead and let people join. 1 second. Okay. So the title of today's session is Racism in America, How We Got Here, Our Part in Making Impactful Change. And we have a wonderful panel discussion today with our Executive Director, Brother Henry Hain, our Board Chair Emeritus, Sister Shakila Ahmad, CARE National Chair and wonderful person, Rula Alush, and a wonderful community member, Dr. Tony Abdullah. Before we begin, we like to go ahead and start with a reminder from the Quran, from the Holy Quran, which is a call to justice. And I will go ahead and ask Brother Henry to begin with the recitation.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين لله شهداء بالقسط ولا يجرمنكم شنعان قوم على ألا تعدلوا اعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون.
Jazakallah khair. I'll go ahead and read the translation. Oh, you who have believed, be persistently standing firm for Allah, witnesses in justice, and do not let the hatred of a people prevent you from being just. Be just, that is nearer to righteousness, and fear Allah. Indeed, Allah is acquainted with what you do. So, I'd like to begin with an introduction. My name is Samina Sohail, and I'm a board member at the Greater Cincinnati Islamic Center of Greater Cincinnati. Once again, I would like to thank you all for joining, our community members who have taken the time to join this important conversation. We'd also like to welcome our many community and faith partners who I've been told have made the effort to join. We truly appreciate it. And finally, I would like to thank our panelists. These are probably some of the busiest people that I know. In preparing for this session, I have learned so much about this very difficult and complex topic. And I really hope that as a community, we all can gain from their insight, inshallah. So let me just begin with a little background about why we decided to do this session. And hopefully that'll put things in context for everyone. As you all probably know, 2020 is a year that many of us will not forget. Usually current events don't come with a disclaimer that they're gonna go down in the history books, but I think this year's a little different. We are gonna remember everything about this year, for sure. And it's really an unprecedented time in our country. In the backdrop of a global pandemic, we're learning new societal norms where, you know, everything that we took for granted and meeting with people and going out has changed. And it's really caused us to kind of reflect upon everything. And then with that, we have the incident like George Floyd's murder. And that is a long overdue national outrage. And it's really amplified the racial injustice of our community and our society today. So anytime current events happen or we look at history, there's two kinds of reflections that usually take place. One is an internal one. And I'm sure many of us as Muslims have asked ourselves when the Prophet, peace be upon him, came with his message of justice, would we have been willing to accept that and give up our tribal allegiances and discriminatory ideals? Or in current times, when a leader called for the annihilation of Jews in Germany, would we have followed the madness? Or in this country, when the civil rights movements of the 60s transpired, would we have marched with the freedom fighters who risked their lives so people of color, people who look like me, could enjoy a seat on the bus or a country free of segregation? So as a community with diverse backgrounds, ICGC is committed to reflect upon our collective deficiencies. And we hope to openly discuss ways of self-improvement with regards to this issue. So our religion and our common humanity teaches us of the equality of mankind and demands for justice. But we can't do this without education, insight, and empathy. And we really hope to foster all of that today. So with that, I'm going to share this verse that actually this call to equality that our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, gave in his last sermon to humanity. And we're all familiar with the words that a white has no superiority over black, nor a black has any superiority over white, except by piety and good action. But knowing this is not enough. It's really the process of internalizing this and fostering empathy that we can make any type of difference. So let me just go ahead and get into the goals of today's session with 3 main disclaimers. Number 1, this is a Muslim American experience, perspective. So what we're going to talk about is one voice of many out there. And also, there is no way that we can cover this topic in its entirety. Hopefully, this is the beginning of ongoing discourse. And then finally, upholding justice is not always comfortable, safe, easy, or even popular. Some things presented today will definitely make us uncomfortable, but I ask everyone to listen with an open heart and an open mind. So the goals today, we want to understand the concept of systemic racism with the historical context and the impact it's had upon society. We want to gain some insight into the African American experience. We really want to look at the role of Muslim Americans confronting our racism, reasons for our action, and the impact of our non-action. And finally, we want to explore how we can make impactful change with education, dialogue, and opportunities for engagement. And with that, I am going to go ahead and introduce our first panelist. So our first panelist is Brother Henry Hain. He is the Executive Director at ICGC who joined us last fall. He has an MA in Urban Education Studies and is currently completing a PhD at Indiana University, Purdue University. Henry Hain's studies frankly and openly address in-depth understanding of complex assets and inequities such as issues of race, ethnicities, cultures, and languages in urban education environments. Henry is a Hillard and Sizemore Research Fellow exposed to the fundamentals of developing a research agenda and career focused on conducting research on African American populations. He's also written a poignant op-ed, which was published in the Cincinnati Enquirer just this morning. I encourage you all to take a look at his op-ed and the many wonderful voices that are being published. And with that, I'd like Henry to get started.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for joining. And Sister Samina, thank you. And as you said, we cannot really cover everything that we need to cover in this session because we're trying to summarize more than, people say 4 centuries or 400 years. I'm saying more than that. So it's impossible to sum up like 500 years of experiences and systemic injustices in just one sitting. But we'll try our best to kind of truncate it into a small session where we get as much as we can, we're capable of. And no way am I saying that everything that I'm saying here is representative of what should be known. I'm just sharing some of the little bit that I've been able to acquire through my studies. And what I'm saying here is not my they're not my ideas or my thoughts. These are studies, published facts that are research based and that were published that I'm kind of just sharing with everybody here. And as I said, so I'm going to start with what the foundation of this whole system from the beginning, and then we'll move on to hopefully up to today and see how things moved from that day to this day in different forms, but with the same exact issues that we're dealing with today. I don't know if Shamina, if you want to share that quote that I have on there. That one right there. This is from Roxanne Damba Ortiz, who is an indigenous person who wrote a book called "The People's History of an Indigenous People's History of the United States." But I encourage everyone to pick up and read also, as it offers a lot of insight on the history of America. And here, as you can see, is the founding of a state based on the ideology of white supremacy, the widespread of African slavery. So there are those of us who have an upbeat hope of a history of redemption and reconciliation, because we all love the country. We have an ideal US and we have a reality US. So all of us would like to see the ideal United States of America. But if you look through the history, what she's saying is, if you look around you and observe, unfortunately, that conclusion is not visible, not even in the utopian dream of a better society. So we are not there yet. The ideal society that we are dreaming of as the United States, we're not there yet, and we've never been there. Just by looking around us, we'll notice why. And as you can see, the protests that are going around and the calls for change that are going around, all of those are manifestations of what she just shared here. So from the beginning, there were people who were living in the United States. And so you had the elite farm owners or elite landowners and farmers or plantation owners. And then you have poor white folks, and then you also have Blacks. So what happens is, I don't know if you've heard of the term called the Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion, basically, Nathaniel Bacon was a plantation owner or landowner. And for selfish reasons, he wanted to ask the other elite farmers to help him with militia so he can go and grab more land from the Native Americans. When they refused to help him, he basically got the poor whites and the Blacks who were here to get together and form a rebellion. So when the rebellion happened, the uprising disturbed the system that was in place. It threatened the system that was in place that was to the advantage of the white elite farmers. So, and also the whole country heard of it, and it started to be replicated in other areas. So what happens is the elite farmers got together, they caught everyone that was part of that, and they basically hang, if not all of them, at least most of them. And they introduced what we call, what is known today as the racial bribe or wedge. So what it is they had to find a way to make sure that never in the rest of the history of the United States will there ever be any possibility of a union between whites and Blacks or anybody else to fight against the system that is existent. But before they got to that racial bribe, they decided if you want to continue this system, we need to find people who are not going to understand each other. So they decided to go to Africa and then import or enslave people who would not speak English, who are from English-speaking countries. So that way they would not be able to communicate with the other folks who are already here. So that's how the idea of, because the whites were not a viable option, because they wanted to encourage immigration from European countries to the United States. So if they enslaved the white folks who were here, that would discourage people from coming to the United States because of fears of being enslaved. So they wanted to encourage that immigration, so they did not go that route. They said that's not a viable route. The only other people that were left here at that point was the Native Americans. And then they figured there is always a chance of the Native Americans being the ones who outnumber everybody to get together and then and fight back. And that was a danger. So the only way to go about it is to get people who are from overseas, who have no connections here, who don't speak the same language as the natives and the whites, and then have them enslaved and work for them. And then we go on to the racial bribe. The racial bribe is basically to take the whites who are here and give them a status that would make them feel superior to the Blacks who were brought in enslaved. So they told the poor whites, you are not the same as the others because you're white. And naturally, we have whites who are superior, right? So you are superior to the Blacks. So don't, and then at the same time, they also made them the people who would also be in charge of the slaves, watch over the slaves and all of that. So from then on, there's no longer a union between the Blacks and the whites at that point. And then it became that way up to this day. Now we move on to the point where a civil war happened. When the Civil War happened, all of a sudden, they found themselves with over 4 million former slaves free and roaming the country. That did not sit well with the folks, with the plantation owners. They couldn't take any chance because they always feared they may not be able to find the labor, enough people for labor. And the blacks walking around free was not right. So they had to find a way to get them back into forced work or labor without it being called slavery. So they enacted what they call convict laws or black codes. So what that does is they have now a paper. Every freed black man now had to have a paper showing that they have work. If you don't have work, you are imprisoned. And when you're imprisoned, you are working without any pay, or little pay, or absolutely no pay. So that same idea of free labor during slavery now is continued under legal avenues that the states enacted. And then we go on and on up to the Reconstruction era. Reconstruction era is where freed black folks had now their freedom to seek their own opportunities. But with the whites controlling the labor market and a person coming to them looking for work, they can always say no. And actually, they had an interest in saying no so that the person can remain unemployed and they can go to jail and they can use them for free labor. In any way, by the time the civil rights, when the Reconstruction happened, there was 0 black folks who were in elected positions in the South. During the Reconstruction era, up to 15% of elected officials in the South were black, right? That wouldn't sit well, just like it didn't sit well after the Civil War that blacks now have freedoms. It didn't sit well that now blacks are finding ways into political positions. So something had to happen, right? And then they continued with their repressive laws up to when we get to the civil wars also, where more freedoms, as we call them, have been passed. Laws have been passed to make sure that we get more protection for black folks and more freedoms for black folks. Mind you, the Constitution did not consider black folks as full citizens. There were 3/5. Therefore, the protection that the white folk had, black folks didn't have. At the same time, they would use them as full citizens only for representation. So let's say Ohio needs 2 representatives or 3 or 4. They need as many people in order for them to have the representation in Washington. They will now allow black folks to become full citizens so they can be counted. But once that goal is gone, that self-serving interest is gone, now they're no longer citizens, now they are 3/5 of a citizen. So they're no longer citizens. So we move on to civil rights where a lot of rights were gained, such as desegregation of schools, many other rights that we know that we up today we have, right? But then something had to come after that. Every time there is positive move for black folks towards upward mobility, there's always a period that comes that is turbulent for them. Then you have the war on drugs introduced by Reagan. So basically at the time that Reagan enacted the war on drugs, mind you, less than 2% of the population of the United States believed that drugs were a problem in the country. By the time he finished his campaign, almost 64% of Americans now believe that drugs were a problem and needed a response. So then at that point, you get the war on drugs started. And the war on drugs, basically what it allowed to happen is now the police had to form what we call SWATs, the special units that are responding to doing drug raids and stuff like that, the SWAT teams. But at the same time, they have incentives now. Every arrest, every drug arrest was $153. Every drug arrest was $153. Later, they enacted what we call finders keepers. So everything that you find, you basically keep as a police department. So a lot of police departments around the country felt this is an opportunity for them to make money because their jobs depended on it, their budgets depended on it. So they had to find arrests. So when they go out there, they're not going out there with safety of our citizens in their mind. They're going out there to make arrests because they need to make that money, and on and on and on. So the war on drugs has a lot of effect on the education of black folks. It has effect on the voting rights of black folks. It has effects on the economy of the black folks. It has many repercussions up to today that we are seeing happening in our Black communities. Police raids our communities on a daily basis, catching everybody. And then you have the possibility of losing your home, your car, because now you have a property that is guilty of illicit drug activity, right? Your home is now suspected to have housed someone or invited a guest that had weed. So all of a sudden, you, the host, your house is gone now because the house is now a witness in a crime. Your car, if let's say you have somebody walking around and then ask for a ride, you give them a ride, they happen to have a weed. You get pulled over. When you get pulled over, you're arrested, your car is impounded. And by the time you finish that sentence, you may be found guilty, but your car is still not free from guilt. So you lose that. And you look at the stats, and that tells you like 18%, 18% fewer homes. Blacks have 18% fewer homes and 4% fewer rental units than whites have. And then you have the control of wealth, where you have the population is 77% white that owns wealth, right? I mean, 77%, but 90% of our wealth is owned by white folks. And then you have population of 13%, which is the Blacks, and only 2.6% of our wealth today is controlled by Black folks. A study also found that 67% of our doctors have a bias against African-American patients. Black drivers have a 30% chance of being more likely to be pulled over by police than anyone else. African-Americans are 2 times as likely to be unemployed as well. And of course, Black students are 3 times likely to be suspended. And if you look at the last slide, you have the Black makeup, which is 13% of our population today are Black, but 40% of our prison population is Black. I'm gonna go and stop here, and maybe questions are gonna come after it because I'm running out of time. And we'll come back if you have any questions relating to everything that I've mentioned, from the Bacon's Rebellion, Civil War, Reconstruction era, civil rights, war on drugs, all of that, education, all of that, you can ask that at the end and we'll come back to it. Thank you. Sorry for going over the time.
So thank you, Brother Hain. I think it really, in the end, highlights the devastating effects of systemic racism upon our society. And that's really a term many of us, at least I was not very familiar with. And I think that's something we should really learn about, because it kind of puts all of what's happening now into context. So thank you so much for that important discussion. Our next presenter is Shakila Ahmad. And it could take the rest of the presentation to go over her credentials, but I will try to limit it. She's been active in the Cincinnati community since her childhood, and with the Islamic Center of Greater Cincinnati since its inception in 1995. She's a past board chair, and she was the first female across the country to hold such a position. She's dedicated over 2 decades to interfaith relations and racial justice work, having served on the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center Board and as its program chair, as well as on the YWCA Cincinnati Board and its racial justice chair. Among her many, many accolades and recognitions, Shakila has received the YWCA Racial Justice Award in 2018 and the Lighthouse Youth Services Humanitarian Award in 2014. So with that, I will ask Shakila to share her discussion about the history of Islam in America, the civil rights movement, impact on immigrant community, and context of discrimination amongst the Muslim Americans.
Thank you so much, Samina. Assalamu alaikum, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Peace be upon all of you, and I start in the name of the Almighty. We're here today for this complex discussion, and I feel for Brother Henry, because covering 500 years in 10, 12 minutes is by no means a fair task to ask anyone to do. I want to kind of start off where he left off and then go from there. Is that, he talked about the most recent systems that are in place in order to really perpetuate the systemic racism that we have in our nation. But, you know, going back to between the civil rights and the Reconstruction period, we had 75 years nearly of Jim Crow laws, which eradicated all the progress that we had made in during the Reconstruction period. And so the effects of those are even here today. I want to take a moment and pick out where we are in regard to the Muslim American community, because that's a perspective that we're humbly trying to present to you today so we can engage in the wider dialogue. If you look at the chart that's in front of you, the people of the Islamic faith in this country are the most diverse faith group in our nation. Nearly a third of them identify themselves as Black or African American. The whites here are a very broad group in the sense that much of the Arab population, some other demographic groups are, in addition to indigenous white folks, are included in that group. South Asians, so on and so forth. And there's a growing Hispanic population because why? There's a growing Hispanic population. And so Muslim Americans have slightly a larger segment of that. And I covered this because to help you understand the diversity, but also have us have a meaningful discussion about the facts, the significance of that 28 to 30% that are part of the Muslim American community that are African American, is that whether you know it or not, as a part of the transatlantic slave trade, nearly 30% of the people that were brought here as a part of that period that Henry talked about is there were Muslims from West Africa. And yes, they couldn't speak English, but that didn't mean they didn't have a culture and a history and education and literature. Literature is part of their culture, is many of them could read and write because they learned to read the Quran at a very young age. And so there are numerous stories of people within our country that, you know, that a testimony to that being the actual reality. The second point in regards to that population and the civil rights movement, and I don't even think most of us, until I just maybe 10 years ago, realized that, you know, I wouldn't be in this country. Samina's parents, Rula's parents, we would not be in this country if our African-American brothers and sisters had not suffered innumerably through the civil rights period, because it was really after 1965 that many of our parents in that generation, and thus us and our children, are Americans and here in this nation. And I want to just take a quick quote from Yasser Qadhi, one of the most prominent Muslim American scholars. And he said, us living the American dream has come at the expense of the nightmare of another segment of humanity that spanned over 400 years. And so it's really important for us as a community to recognize that first and foremost as we get into this conversation and what it is that we need to be doing. Samina, next slide. Thank you. So the history of Muslims in America is rich and it's deep, and we owe it to our African-American brothers and sisters. And there are studies and some artifacts and such that really bring about the discussion of prior 1492, but really, as we talked about at the slave trade, particularly the Muslims from West Africa being a significant part of our foundation. The Middle Eastern, population began to come in smaller numbers, 1800s, 1900s. We have early Anglo-American converts as well. And then our early African-American rediscovery and reversion. I don't know if people realize that 60 to 70% of the population that is converting or reverting or accepting Islam happen to be African-American. Many of them are rediscovering their roots. Many are just looking for answers like the rest of us. And then we get into the continued immigration and conversions from 1965 to current day America that I touched on. Next slide. If you really look at some of the historical data in terms of the coming to America after Columbus, African Americans involved in the slave trade for whatever period of time, for whatever in small ways, because those people not only they lost their freedom, they lost their culture, they lost their language, heritage, faith, everything, can be seen in some of this historical imagery and context, such as the photo that we have here, and bringing over a part of that rich African heritage that did exist that we completely are unaware of. Next slide. If you look at some of these incredibly special people, you have from people that became businessmen to Saleh Bilal, who served as an imam in the early plantation days, to a prince who was caught up in this transatlantic slave trade, who could read and really worked for his freedom by working for a printing press, and then eventually really becoming a part of the movement. And his story is at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, as well as some of these others, and I implore you to take a look. And then there were early abolitionists that included prominent African Americans as well. Samina? You know, two of the most well-known Muslim Americans would be Malcolm X or Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. And the reason that I bring up Malcolm X is because Malcolm X was originally a part of the Nation of Islam, which at that time, you know, indicated that there was a disparity between the races, and the founder was a prophet of God. Those are two things inconsistent with the teaching of Islam, but it had an incredible history of uniting and creating a culture for the African American population. But when he went for Hajj and was with millions of other people from all around the world, he wrote about the power of being able to stand next to equally between, you know, the bluest of bluest eyes and the blondest of blonde hair, and really be accountable to our one creator with really our actions on this earth and the way that we live our life. And it transformed him. And I implore people to read his biography in order to learn more about that transformation and the power of his message. In addition, we have, you know, faith has been a part of the movement for justice. Nobody is more well known than the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And, you know, his dream is our dream. You know, we stand with him in those words of solidarity and the dream that we still have for our children, our grandchildren. Muhammad Ali incredibly respected both of these individuals, and, you know, said it very plainly, is that degrading any people because of their color is wrong. Doesn't matter who's doing it and, you know, who is it being done to. And that's an important lesson for us as Muslim Americans, because sometimes we fall into our own tribalism and we tend to think that people, you know, who are Pakistani are the best, or that if I'm Arab from, you know, Egypt, I really have, you know, think something above anybody else, or if I'm from anywhere. And so it's really important for us to understand the foundation in our religion, as well as these incredibly wise and active historical individuals. Samina? You know, the reality is that racism does exist in the Muslim American community. And it is something that we need to face up to and really take concrete actions in order to both make ourselves aware, educated, and transform our behavior. And if you look at these two charts by ISPU, an incredible organization that does research for the Muslim American and on the Muslim American community, as well as attitudes about the Muslim American community, you look and see that though the Muslim American community is slightly less racist in terms of its actions and words and attitudes towards African Americans, the sad part of it is it's still 66%. The saddest part of it is that 75% of our African brothers and sisters across America experience racism, you know, and sometimes on a daily basis. And we've seen the end results of some of that racism and how prevalent it is within our systems in place. Yeah. So at this particular point in time, I think what I want to do is allow our colleagues to speak further, and then we'll come back and talk about both actions and answer your questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Shakila. I know you have a wealth of more knowledge about this issue and could go on, and it's really sad that we are limited by time, just highlighting how important we need to continue these conversations. So now I'm going to introduce our next panelist. This is Dr. Tony Abdullah. Dr. Tony Abdullah is originally from Cincinnati, Ohio. He completed his undergraduate degree at the University of Cincinnati. He then pursued his medical degree from the University of Toledo and a residency from Wright State University. He is board certified in emergency medicine and practices locally. He has been married to Jelaine for 25 years, and they have 3 sons, Amir, Jassim, and Ali, all of which have attended the International Academy of Cincinnati from pre-K through 8th grade. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. First, I want to thank everybody, particularly Samina, for putting the panel together, and everybody on the panel for taking your time to do this. I mean, it really is personal to me. It makes me feel included. It makes me feel like I have a community in my corner, because we have this diverse panel coming together, and we spoke all this time. It's been 37 minutes to speak about issues that are personally important to me. I mean, I really, really appreciate it. And I don't want that to go unsaid. And everybody did a really good job, and Henry did a phenomenal job compressing all of this history in a short amount of time. He had a big job to do. I don't want the history to, I don't want something to be lost after the history, though, because I have to speak a little bit about culture and its impact on today. See, we think of all of these things, particularly like slavery and its impact on the Black American, as though it's ancient history. Really, it's not that far away. I have taken care of patients whose grandparents were slaves. So there are living people who have intimate experience with that institution. And like I mentioned before, I can't let the idea that culture isn't important. Culture is what teaches us how to be as a people, and culture is old. Culture is a social behavior and norms in a society. These cultural norms codify behavior and conduct in a people. So it teaches you how to act. It teaches you how to be. It teaches success. It is an old concept. For instance, the Chinese have a concept that's called guanxi. And guanxi, in short, is kind of like, it's not what you know, but who you know. It's the individual's personal connections that help them with their life and help them with business. You even have communities of people who get together. They say, okay, such and such is doing this, so we're going to support this person so that they can be successful. You have these concepts that are very old, and they teach you how to be. I think for the Black American, the things that are old that teach us how to be stopped when we got here in 1619, 1620, and we've had to try to piece together, because like Henry mentioned earlier, when we were taken and brought over in groups that couldn't communicate. So a person from this country put next to a person from this country, put next to a person from this country, so that they couldn't speak and communicate. Then when we get here, I want people to understand, listen to the parallels between then and now. So when we get here, we're unable to be educated. It is against the law to educate the Black. We can't read, we can't write. You're not allowed to gather. You could be married, but at any time, the slave owner could come in and take your wife from you, could do anything with your wife, could take your children, could take your friends, your brother, your family away from you. So I think it was hard for them to maintain closeness in relationship and to even build one another because it was always being interrupted and always being taken. So that became our culture. And so that kind of thing is old, and it stays with the person, just like Guanxi stays with the Chinese, or just like like Talmudic principles stay with the Jewish, or the cultures that we have before coming here. Those things are old. It's not a coincidence, for instance, that Asians are the highest educated and the highest paid ethnic group in the country. It's not a coincidence. This is something that is instilled in them. So the things that kind of got instilled in us, we've had, have been a lot of negative. We've had to try to do the best we can to piece it together. So it's kind of like, and I used this example the other day, I like to travel. So, so one thing that people say, well, there's so much opportunity. I've heard this before. I've had conversations, people say, well, look, the Black American, they cry about everything, and there's America's the land of opportunity. You know where you can go to school, you know how to do this or that. But again, I like to travel. It's like putting a jet in my front yard. I know what the jet does. I know how, what you're supposed to do with jet, but I don't know how to fly a jet. I've never been taught how to fly a jet. So that jet sits in my front yard. That's all the opportunity in the world to fly the world. But because I don't know how to fly a jet, I'm stuck in the same place. It's an old, I lost my train of thought, but it's an old concept. And so it is, I've been very fortunate, because people will then say, well, look at you, you've done well, you're a physician, you've done this, that, and third, so you took advantage. But I had something, subhanAllah, that a lot of us don't necessarily have. I had Islam that came down on me and patched the hole. I mean, I was born Muslim, my family is Muslim, but we had this and it patched the holes that we had. So this was something that was it's a miracle for us, and it helped bring us together. It built a family structure for us. We established norms. You do this, you don't do this, all of these things, all of these guidelines in Islam. And it also patched together for us, not only a culture, but a family among other groups who have been successful. But a lot of us don't have that. So what I'm trying to do is answer the question of how we got here. We eventually are going to have to answer the question of what do you want and where do we go from here? I think the biggest thing, first of all, is first compassion, and then education, like we started today. This is a little bit here, but there's a list of books and videos that people can watch and listen to these things. Look out, because this is not Black information. This is not Black history. This is American history. We're all American. We live here. This is our home. So we have to educate ourselves about one another, particularly about this issue, because this is a strong issue. This is a stain in American culture that has never been washed out. And the only way to do this is for us to talk about it and us to deal with it. And again, to have compassion, because diversity must be forced. If we leave it up to ourselves, we will, if we leave it up to deal with itself, it will never be done, because it's uncomfortable. And, I think even sitting here, just the five of us, somebody is, even myself, just a little uncomfortable, because we don't want to offend anybody. We may not know as much about a group as we feel as we should, and all kinds of reasons that it's uncomfortable. But this is a beautiful thing that has been established for us to do and participate in. And this is why I kind of came from under my rock to do this, because people who know me know that I'm a busy guy and I don't get out much. And you know, some of my closest friends have actually forced themselves to be my friends, because I don't get out too much. But I saw this and I was called upon to participate, so I wanted to make sure that I came forward and gave my perspective, because you know, I thought that it was important. You know, and one more thing about because there's going to be a lot of with this movement, particularly with Floyd, who was killed, you know, a couple weeks ago. I'm loving seeing all of the help and all of the compromise and togetherness that I'm seeing. It's great, but I do want people to watch for certain things too. One thing that they'll do is people will try to detract from it. They'll try to besmirch the man's image. They'll try to say he was, you know, he was this, he was that, he had drugs on him. None of that matters. What matters is that this person is that what happened to him. The police are not judge, jury, and executioner. We have due process in this country. So it was not upon them to take a man's life in the street. It didn't matter if he murdered somebody around the corner. They are to enforce the law and to take him before a judge and a jury of his peers, not to execute a man on the street. So I don't want that to be lost on us either, that, you know, because this kind of thing always comes up. Well, look what he did. Or what typically happens is that they find one of our own group to make him look bad as well. Well, this is something that's old as well. The overseers who punished the slaves and managed the slaves were Black as well, because they were forced into it. And they get a little bit of something extra. You know, maybe they get a little more something to eat, or they get a little bit of better of accommodation to harm their brothers and sisters. And the same things, these same parallels go on today. So I don't want that to be lost. It was something else. Oh, kind of what we could do. Again, compassion, educate ourselves about one another. Take that step also, and step outside of your comfort zone and invite someone who is outside of your social group. Hey, why don't you come, you know, eat with my family? Why don't we, you know, go to the park and socialize or whatever? And sometimes it's not a home run, but that's not representative of the group. Maybe you'll get somebody that it doesn't gel with yourself or your family, but try again, and then try again, and then try again, because it makes us familiar with one another. Again, diversity must be forced. This is an active process that we have to do with one another. And today is beautiful. I mean, I really don't even have the words to say. You know, I'm not going to be as eloquent as some who do this all the time, or kind of. I'm just a regular guy. I work and you know, put my pants on one leg at a time and come home and feed my family. I'm not an activist or anything like that. I'm just, you know, a regular guy.
Thank you, Tony. First of all, now that you have come out from under your rock, we're not going to let you go back in. And second of all, you do have just a minute or two left. Can you just share with us what it's like for you and your family to be an African American today in Westchester, Ohio?
Well, it is, you know, overall it's pretty good, but the thing is that we get used to abnormal in the being Black in the United States. You know, you get used to making sure, and this is the things I tell myself and my children. You know, you get used to, you don't put your hoodie on in a store. You don't take too long or walk in the store, or else you're gonna get followed. You know, you get pulled over by a police officer, it's arms at 10 and 2, you announce what you're gonna do, you don't make any moves. He tells you to get your license, you don't get that license. You say, hey, is it okay if I get my license? It's in the glove compartment. All of these kinds of things are interwoven into what life is like being Black in America. I have a good life. I can't complain about my life overall, but I do think that I have, there's an extra burden to being Black in America that people who are not Black don't have these things. It's a completely foreign concept to them. It is, you know, it's not like living in DC or Atlanta or cities where there are a lot of Black people. We don't have a huge power base or a lot of representation here, especially, you know, educated, well-to-do Black people. You you don't see a lot. So it is what it is. I'm not miserable. Again, alhamdulillah, I've got a very good life, but you know, these are some things that I see from my perspective.
Thank you, Tony. That was very, very insightful, and we'd love to hear more from you. So remember, you're not going back under that rock anytime soon, inshallah. So our next panelist is Sister Rula Alouche. Rula Alouche is a trial attorney with Graydon Law. She has experience in employment law, civil rights, insurance defense, and general civil litigation. She earned her undergraduate degree, magna cum laude, from the University of Kentucky in 2003, and her Juris Doctor from the University of Kentucky College of Law in 2006. She's licensed to practice in all state and federal courts in Kentucky and Ohio and before the United States Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Ms. Alouche is an active member of the legal community and the community at large. She currently serves as the chair of the National Board of Directors of the Council on American Islamic Relations, otherwise known as CARE, the nation's largest civil rights and advocacy group for American Muslim community. She is a member of the board of directors of the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative and serves as Kentucky delegate to the Association's House of Delegates. Ms. Alouche was recently recognized as a Daughter of Greatness by the Muhammad Ali Center and serves on the center's board of directors. She is also a faculty member with Islamic Seminary of America. So we welcome her, and she is going to be talking about police brutality, the justice system, the interplay of civil rights and color issues in our communities. So you have 10 minutes to cover quite a bit.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's really an honor to be with all of you, and I want to begin by thanking the leadership of the Islamic Center of Greater Cincinnati for putting this forum together, this important discussion for my fellow panelists. And if I may, Brother Tony, perhaps especially you, because you were sharing such a personal experience for you and your family, and self-identified, not an activist and used to doing these things necessarily, but it's important that we hear the voices of those who are most impacted. So thank you, and thank you to my other fellow panelists. This is a really tough time for each of us, and I personally have felt very emotional since we witnessed the murder of George Floyd, and there's a power to the movement that's happening in the country right now, and I hope that we as a community, not just in Cincinnati, but especially, you know, what we start local, so especially that our local Muslim community will really respond to the call to action that's happening here. Recognizing that it's a tough time, I want to begin a little differently than a lawyer and an activist may usually, but I just want to send love. I want to send love to my brothers and sisters, and especially to my African-American and Black brothers and sisters who are struggling with so many feelings right now, and show love and support and express that while these are really tough times, we are here with you, and we'll do, I hope I can speak for our entire community when I say we will do all that we can to work against the challenges and injustices that the Black American community in America faces. SubhanAllah, so I, as a Cincinnatian, I live right outside, I live in OTR, and there was a protest just earlier this afternoon that was happening right by my window. I wanted to just play a moment of it so you all could witness some of what's been happening. And you hear people saying the name Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. It was a sea of people, very, very diverse, that were passing by my window for probably about 15 minutes just before we started. So it's a powerful movement right now, and I like to think of it as a global call to action, saying enough is enough, and that we're going to stand in solidarity against the brutality that's happening and the injustices that are happening in our country. We talked about, mashallah, such an excellent job done by my fellow panelists and the people who presented before. I just wanted to share briefly about the most recent instances of violence that have happened against members of the Black community in America, and how that led us to where we are today in these protests that were happening right outside my door. Within the matter of a couple of weeks, we witnessed the video that reflected the murder of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, a young man who had been running in a neighborhood and seemed to be tracked down and chased by 3 white men who claimed that they were patrolling and protecting the streets with no authority to do so. And for over 70 days, Ahmaud Arbery had been murdered, and there was not a single action taken in terms of arrest or even what seemed like a real investigation into his murder until a video came out. And then there was a push, especially in Georgia, for justice for Ahmaud. And ultimately, the 2 men were arrested, and finally the third man was arrested. The next instance was Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. And as a Kentuckian, it broke my heart to know that in what is supposed to be the most progressive city in Louisville, in Kentucky, Louisville police, under wearing regular clothing, not identifying themselves as police, bursted into her home in the middle of the night. Her partner fired shots to protect him and Breonna in their home under his Second Amendment right to do so. The police responded with multiple rounds of weapons, and Breonna was shot and killed while she was sleeping in her bed. She was 26 years old. Her 27th birthday would have been Friday. And finally, George Floyd, people saw the video, or at least many know of the video of a police officer in Minneapolis who kept his knee on George's neck for close to 9 minutes as George screamed out and yelled out for his mother, saying that he couldn't breathe. And so this is the background to where we are right now. And I think facts matter. So you've heard a lot from members of our community trying to educate about, the systemic racism that our country has faced. And I would just encourage you all, each of us, to learn more, educate ourselves on what the facts are, because the reality is that we have a brutal history in our country of violence against members of the African American community, Black Americans, and it's a true fact that we just need to be aware of. And as Muslims, especially those of us who are Muslim and outside of the African American community, in order to show true solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters and to be true practices of our faith, I would suggest that we really need to know what the history is, so that inshallah we can work together to a better solution in the future. There was a lot of mention of history. As an attorney, I just wanted to touch briefly on the justice system in our country, which unfortunately often is called the criminal injustice system when it comes to African Americans. There are a lot of facts that people could learn about the disproportionate impact of how laws in our country impact members of the Black community. There are some statistics that Samina is going to put up that you can see. I'm not one for reading slides, so I'll leave that for you to review, but I'll just emphasize some of the points that Sister Shakila made so well about the long history of laws in our country and how they have led to this moment, starting, of course, with the enslavement of people forced to come to the US from Africa for economic reasons primarily, and also other injustices. But in more recent years, and it wasn't that long ago, as one of my fellow panelists shared, that we had Jim Crow laws in this country, segregation, many other challenges, including crime bills and mass incarceration challenges, and other legislation and actions that were taken, including mandatory sentencing guidelines, which have disproportionately impacted and challenged members of the Black community. And one of the, I think, things that's important for us as individuals who are concerned about these challenges is to recognize that they are in all parts of our lives, and in particular in all parts of our justice system. So while we talk about police brutality and police violence, and I saw a question asking about police violence specifically, and how can we react if we might have close friends or ties with individuals who are in the police force. And I would just remind us that we have an obligation to speak out for all of us. So even if I myself am good to most people, but not good to another, the verse in the Quran that we began this session with tells me that I have to speak out against the injustice that I myself am committing. So we have an obligation to use our voices to bring impact for members of our community. The other thing I would point out when we're talking about the justice system and the injustices that it sometimes unfortunately perpetuates on our brothers and sisters is that it is truly on different levels. And it's not just the police that we're talking about. We're talking about prosecutors who make decisions about charging. We're talking about juries, and are we really having juries of individuals, peers that are trying them and hearing the cases that are going to trial? And then of course the ever important role of judges, who have a lot of discretion when it comes to how they hear motions, make decisions that are involving people's lives, and then very, very importantly on sentencing. So, have to encourage us all to own our political power as a community, to own our individual political power, and not just concern ourselves with national elections and national politics, but really be involved on a local level in races. So vote, register to vote if you're not registered, get your people registered, vote, run for office. You know, when we saw Keith Ellison as the Muslim Attorney General of Minnesota take over the investigation, I wonder how many of us felt a sense of comfort that we know our brother is going to work for justice here. And we have an obligation to pursue roles of leadership that will allow us to use our voices for good. So I just want to make sure that we highlight our political power as a community. So I next want to talk about, and I actually, before moving to the next subject, just to finalize the conversation about our injustice system, one of the resources that we're going to share is a book and movie by Brian Stevenson, Just Mercy, speaking about his experiences as a Harvard graduated attorney fighting for individuals who are innocent but face the death sentence on death row. And he has a really profound quote I wanted to share. He shares that we have a criminal justice system that cares more about you if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And that, I think, speaks to the interplay and interconnection of a number of challenges that the justice system has. A lot of these issues led to the founding of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013. It's something that many of us hear about and have heard about in recent weeks, of course. As the protesters passed my house, they were chanting Black Lives Matter as one of the other chants that they were mentioning, in addition to saying the names George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And the Black Lives Matter movement was formed in 2013, very specifically following the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who was a non-officer that was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin, a young man who was going to the corner store to get Sprite and Skittles, I believe, wearing a hoodie, and he was gunned down by Mr. Zimmerman, who ultimately did not serve time for the charge of murder. He was acquitted by a jury in Florida. Following the Trayvon Martin murder and trial, we saw the murders of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. Eric Garner relates to what happened with George Floyd. Eric Garner is the man in New York who was being stopped by police for a very minor issue when you weigh it against human life, and was sharing with them that he couldn't breathe, and he kept saying he couldn't breathe. And so following the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, the Black Lives Matter movement gained national and really international recognition. 2 points about the Black Lives Matter movement that I want to share. One is that it started, as I said, in 2013. This was under President Obama's presidency. I think that's relevant for 2 points. One, it shows us that just because we had a Black president does not mean we were somehow in some post-racial society, that these challenges have been with us since the founding of our country, and we have to do what we can to put an end to it. And the other part to that, to me, is that it's not a Republican or a Democratic issue. It's not a political issue. It is truly an American problem that we need to work against. The Black Lives Matter movement gets sometimes the pushback that all lives matter. And I wanted to touch on that for a moment and speak just from my own personal perspective on that. There are so many resources that one could learn about, and I encourage you all to take some time, especially during these times of COVID, as we're looking to see what options, what information is out there, since we're staying home and trying to stay safe as much as we can. The proper response to Black Lives Matter is Black Lives Matter. It is not all lives matter. It is not Palestinian lives matter or Syrian lives matter or Pakistani lives matter. Respectfully, it is Black Lives Matter. And that is because we have a systemic issue of white supremacy, white nationalism in our country that is disproportionately impacting African Americans. And it has, as was laid out so well by my fellow panelists, in so many other ways as well. The proper response would be to center the lives of those who matter. And of course, as a Syrian American, I'm very concerned about what's happening in Syria. As a Muslim, I'm concerned about injustices around the world. So this is not to say that those causes don't matter and those people don't matter. Each human life matters. This is what we were taught by our creator. And so the call for Black Lives Matter is because of the facts and statistics that we hear and know that we need to work to improve. So the final point I want to make, and apologies if I'm jumping a little bit, there's so much to share in a short period of time. I really want to address my Muslim brothers and sisters, my community. Many times I've heard Muslims say, racism is so bad, anti-Black racism is so bad, alhamdulillah for Islam, and we don't have that problem. And then I wonder what experiences those people saying that have, because I would venture to guess that many of my Black brothers and sisters would say very differently. And even myself as an Arab American, I have a different experience where I've witnessed anti-Black racism in a number of ways, family gatherings, community gatherings, masjid gatherings. This is a reality of our community, and we're not doing anyone any favors if we pretend that it doesn't exist. We are a microcosm of society. Humanity has these challenges, and we need, I think, to rely on our faith and our education and knowledge, our society as an ummah to improve against these challenges. We are prescribed by our faith to follow the practice that we will stand against injustice, even if it's against ourselves, even if it's against our parents. And as a Muslim, I've been reflecting on that a lot in the past few weeks. We know of the teachings of our Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, your mother, your mother, your mother, your father. We know this, we respect it. And at the same time, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to speak against injustice, even if committed even if by our parents. And to me, that speaks so profoundly to how obligatory it is on each of us to work against these challenges. And in this time where so many people are coming together to say enough, I think as Muslims, and now I'm going to speak very specifically to my non-Black Muslim brothers and sisters, so white, Arab, Desi, whatever ethnic background one may identify with, those of us who really stand in support and solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters, we have to look in the mirror and look at the experiences that we have. We have to speak out against anti-Black racism that we see in ourselves, in our communities, in our families. Be the person that says from this day forward, we're no longer going to allow these things to happen. I've seen too many instances of Arabs using a racist term to refer to Black people. I've been told by friends about a racist term that can be used by South Asians about Black people. This is not acceptable. And just like we see white Americans use the N-word, we can't allow ourselves to fall into those same practices. And as those of us who are within this community, this joined ummah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, who said to us, and I've seen this quote so much the past few weeks, an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab over an Arab, a Black over a white, or a white over a Black, except in acts of righteousness. So my call to action to each of us brothers and sisters is let's take that call. Let's do what we can. Let's take advantage of the momentum and the moment and the passion that's happening to correct the injustices that we see in every part of our lives.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Rula. So much more could be said on the topic of the skin issues and the color issues we have in our community. But I think, especially as women, we know what we're talking about, and we really need to introspect about that because it really does more damage than good. So with that, we've raised a lot of issues. Brother Henry's talked about, the historical context of African Americans in this country, the impact of systemic racism. Shakila has gone over discriminatory rates in our own communities, and also the history of Muslim Americans in this country. Dr. Abdullah has talked about the important role culture plays in defining who we are, as well as talked about also his own personal experience. And Rula has really kind of brought it all together with the role of the Black Lives Matter movement, the role of the justice system. And now we come to the $1 million question. And maybe I'll give each panelist a couple minutes. We're having a very healthy conversation in our group chat as well, asking something similar. So we know what this is all happening. How can we fix this? And I will start with Brother Henry. No pressure.
There you go. Thank you. I'm gonna start from where Dr. Abdullah and Anthony Abdullah finished, or at least touched on, which is history versus reality, right? There is a term that they call coloniality. When you hear the term coloniality, you think in colonialism. But the person who coined that term, the reason he coined the term, Kuwahito is his name. The reason he coined the term is because people always think of the effects of those events as history as the past. So systemic racism was also coined by the brother who is known as Kwame Ture. He termed this the institutionalized racism in order for people to understand this is not the history, this is not the past. And I think we touched on a lot of issues that allowed us to kind of understand the reality that exists today is the constant need or the constant pursuit of denying Black folks of the basic rights, the basic freedoms. So it is a reality that exists around us. It's a reality that exists. Just looking around, you will see what's happening. And the other thing that I wanted to come back to also is to understand that what is sought after is not just for the police officer who killed George Floyd or those who witnessed it to be locked up. That's not the change that people are looking for. We're looking for something that is systemic. So that means there are a lot of changes that need to happen. For that to happen, people have to understand. Education is extremely important. I'd encourage people to learn more about systemic racism, to understand how it affects people in order for us to understand our obligation as human beings, obligations as Muslims, to actually push for that change to happen. And then please, let's learn from the people who are experiencing it. They have a wealth of knowledge that you will not find in books. They have a wealth of knowledge that you will not find in articles or any videos. Let's engage the conversations with people who are experiencing this so we can understand their perspectives, so we can understand their experiences, so that when we engage into an action to bring change, we engage with the right perspective.
Jazakallah khair. That's really the very, very important is understanding, engaging, and then gaining empathy. So I'm going to ask Sister Shakila for some of her thoughts on solutions.
You know, Samina, I'm going to, there's so much wisdom that's been parted, and I'm sure that there are concrete things in the chat as well. I want to just capitalize on two sayings of the Prophet Muhammad in order to relate it to what we can concretely do. And the first saying of the Prophet is that he is well known, and the saying that whoever of you sees evil, let him change it with his hand. And if he is not able to change, if he's not able to do that, then let him use his tongue to make that change. And if he is not able to do that, then hate it in your heart. And that is the weakest of the three. And so in order to have this systemic change, I think, you know, the education, the connection with people that we are not connected with, that are experiencing it directly, is essential. But at the same time, I want to give an example of changing it with your hands. Is I saw a video of one police officer taking, you know, an unjustifiable action against the other. And before he could do that, his coworker, his colleague, his fellow police officer stopped him. Okay, so there are those who will stand by and let a man suffocate for 9 minutes and not do anything. And there are those who will stop it with their hand if they know that that is evil and that is wrong. We have the opportunity every time that we see, whether it's a microaggression or a physical aggression, is to take action. And staying silent and not doing anything is not an option. And so you can do what my sister is doing right now. You can be at the march downtown. You can take action by looking at the issues that are becoming laws and who's getting elected, and physically getting engaged in order to make sure that laws that are discriminatory are not passed. You can go to the Freedom Center for the programs that not only educate people, but they enlighten and inspire people to learn from the stories that are so inspirational, that are right, you know, right before us, that we have the opportunity to take advantage of. You can be silent and take action by, you know, writing letters, by doing the voting. And lastly, is at minimum, educate enough and know enough and connect enough to know that this is not humane behavior. This is not what any of our faiths teach us. And this is not something that can be justified while it's on our watch. The second hadith of the Prophet that I wanna just reference is that heaven lies underneath the feet of the mother. And I'm gonna try to do this without crying, because I have not been able to watch the entire 9 minutes because it is entirely too painful. So when you see a fellow human being calling his mama twice before he loses his life, that is a call on each one of us who is a mother in order to speak up for justice and work towards justice. That could have been any of our kids, and that could be any of your kids. And so what world is it that we want to leave behind for our children and our grandchildren? We may not see the trees and the fruits of the labor that we take action on today, but those seeds will be planted. Do your part. And I'm sorry, I don't have time to go into a lot of concrete, but we will make sure that those organizations and the actions that you can take are there. But just remember is that you have the opportunity every day to make change with your hands, to make change with your heart, and take action, and that these are all boys that are somebody's children.
Thank you,
girls.
Thank you, Shakila. That is such a poignant reminder that you know, all the education in the world cannot foster that empathy and compassion, which we really need to strive towards, because that's the only way I feel personally that we're going to move forward, inshallah. Before I continue with our other two panelists, the group chat is raising a lot of great questions, which I'm not sure if we'll be able to get to all of. However, I would also like you as the community to post some solutions, concrete solutions for us to improve our community, especially at the Islamic Center, because we don't have all the answers and we are blinded by some of the things we say, the things we do, and we want to know about it. And as the audience, please post action items that we can do as a community also, because just as much as you are learning from these panelists, we can learn from you, inshallah. And with that, I'd like to ask Dr. Abdullah to share his thoughts of how do we fix this?
Okay, well, I'm gonna fix everybody's problems in the next 45 seconds. I don't know. I'm gonna try my best, and I just kind of have made this up, just kind of thinking. First, I think we need to have compassion for one another. We need to treat our brother and sister like we would want to be treated ourselves. That's something. Those are easy words, but for some, I think as human beings, it is difficult for us to do that, and it must be forced. Like I talk about with diversity, we have to force ourselves to do that. So have compassion for one another. Have compassion for that person who doesn't get invited, or they look different than you, or there's a preconceived notion about that. That's the one that we should reach out to. And this is my next point is get outside of our comfort zone. Reach out to someone who is different, and invite them over. In fact, after the virus is over, I'll help everybody because I am taking and accepting invitations to dinner if anybody's asking. So, but reach outside of your comfort zone and invite somebody, learn from one another. Don't be afraid to talk. Don't be afraid to ask these questions, because we want to, as a Black American, I want to answer these questions. I want to talk to people. I want people to understand my perspective. Educate ourselves. Let's educate ourselves about one another. This is all of our history. This is American history. So again, this is part of the conversation. Let's educate ourselves. And the last point I had, and I'm sure that there are many more points, but this is just kind of what I could come up with, is kind of reach out and reach back. I've tried to do this, and I bring this last point up because my wife and I started a scholarship at the school, and this is not ordinarily, this is not my move. I don't like to advertise. I don't want to brag or anything like that, but I thought it was important because I want it to be infectious. I want people to see this and think, we can do this. We can participate in this. We can give to this. And I want someone to come forward and outdo me. I want them to say, okay, well, he gave the scholarship. This is going to be for one child who can go through, pre-K through 8 at the school and get, an Islamic-based education here, and it's paid for. I'm going to do 2 kids. And I want the next person to say, I'm going to do 3. And I want everyone else to come back and be better than myself. So compassion, education, get outside the comfort zone, reach out, reach back, and try to help those who need help.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah. And I know that you are an incredible chef. So maybe we'll be showing up at your house for that get-together meal.
I love it. I love it.
And you spoke to my heart as a co-parent of the International Academy. I cannot even echo what a wonderful institution it is to really build character, integrity, and respect. So thank you so much for that scholarship. It really means a lot.
Thank you. And everybody, again, thanks for the panel. Everybody, I mean, really, it really has touched my heart. Everybody, I really appreciate it. I can't wait to see everybody in person, and thank everybody in person. And my heart really goes out to everybody. I really appreciate this.
Alhamdulillah. So now, Sister Rula, what are your thoughts? How do we fix this?
Just a couple of things, and mashallah, +1 to everything that's been said before. And I'd just highlight the education component and how important it is for us to be educated on the history, educated on our faith as people of faith, and then do what we can moving forward. I would also suggest amplifying the voices of those most directly impacted. So as Muslims, there are some Muslim-based organizations that are fighting racism in our community. Muslim ARC, the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, the Muslim Wellness Foundation. There's a group in Chicago, the Inner City Muslim Action Network, IMANA, that are all doing incredible work. And then you see on the screen a number of organizations that are collaborating with sister organizations to try to work towards fighting against this injustice. So to me, it's education, and it's a matter of acting on our faith and being courageous, even when it might be tough to speak for justice. That's what we're obligated to do.
Jazakallah khair. So one suggestion that came up was, can the masjid organize a book drive to buy and distribute literature to educate the community on this issue? And I'm glad that point was raised, because we've put together a list of some of the books and resources that can help us educate ourselves and each other. And I'm just thinking out loud here, maybe we can have this panel come back together to do book clubs on these books, or watch these documentaries or movies as a community and reflect upon them. This is by no means a fully exhaustive list. This is just a few things we put together as panelists that we thought were very important to be read. We can make this picture available in our social media platforms, but just, read and learn. Some people are readers. Some people need to see movies. Some people need to see documentaries. Some people need to see just stories. Whatever it takes, I challenge our community to take it up and really, really learn more. And with that, I would also like to just leave this one slide. This was put together by an imam in Orlando by the name of Arthur Richards, and he works with LaunchGood, and he just put together some things that we can do under the title of "Silence Isn't an Option, so what can you do?" As I suggested, let's read up on the Black suffering in America. There's also books like Dr. Sherman Jackson's Islam and the Black American, some of the Netflix and other documentaries I mentioned. It's time to have honest and have difficult conversations, which we've tried to do today. And once again, we really appreciate those who took the time on the Sunday afternoon to join us. And I hope all the others that didn't is because they're out there marching with the protesters, inshallah. And reach out to the people of color, especially the African-American community around you.
If I may?
Yes, go ahead.
I just had a few more suggestions. Again, it's very presumptuous of me to if I think I can solve this problem, but I can offer some suggestions and then things that are concrete for people that people can do.
Sure.
confronting one's own bias, no one else can do it for you. You're the only one who can do it for yourself. You know yourself. You know deep down in yourself what kind of biases you are. Some you may not be aware of, some you may be aware of. Make sure that at least from your end, like Prophet ﷺ says, make sure that no human being, especially Muslims, suffer from your hand. That's one. Second thing is the school curriculum where your kids go. It's time that our schools started to tell the true history of America and the sufferings of African Americans in America. And one thing that you can do as a parent is you can ask those questions to your superintendent, to your principal as to what books are being taught. How can we make sure that my kids learn about this, right? Second thing is your banks. You bank at a bank. We all know that the systemic racism also is weaved through mortgages. You ask your bank, what kind of programs do you have to make sure that African Americans are not barred from good interest interest-free or good interest rate mortgages that are made available to everybody else, right? All these questions you can ask directly to people that you do business with. Your police department, reach out to the police department. Ask, what have you put in place to address these issues that keep coming back on and on and on for decades and centuries? How can we hold them accountable? Let's ask them, what plan do you have? How can I access it? When will I know when you make a decision on these plans and stuff like that? So those are just a few concrete examples that I can offer. Hopefully people can actually follow up on those and hopefully learn more and get more, inshallah.
So what that reflects is that this list needs to be a lot longer, and perhaps we can put something together to share with the community. Just want to continue, take the time out to support the campaigns that uplift the Black community. And I think we will try to get this one out too. And this is also just some of the organizations that are doing good work. And finally, probably the most important thing is, actually two things. Number one, it's not just about us. Our youth are our future, and perhaps I hope and pray they do better than us. And they make the change in the world that maybe we want to see and we aspire to see. And ICGC's youth group under our youth coordinator, Isa Razi, is doing great virtual sessions. And I hope the community does join those, but I also hope that as parents, we have these discussions with our children, we get them involved so that they can be the change that we want to see in the future, inshallah. And finally, probably the most important point I want to make is once the Facebook and Instagram and the news cycle stops giving this coverage, don't put it to bed. Don't let it rest. Anything that's swept under the rug only comes back even more toxic and more painful later on. And we really, really, really need to make sure that this is not just, today's fad to talk about and tomorrow forgotten. So I really hope and pray that we become a community of justice and a community that is committed to living up to our ideals as Muslims, as humanity asks us to, inshallah. So we've reached the end. Let me just go through our comments and see if we have any unaddressed questions before we conclude. I think most of them we have gotten to. Some of these are questions like what direct actions Muslim community and our mosque should be taking to address racism in our Muslim community and our wider community. I think we've touched upon that unless somebody wants to add to anything we haven't said already.
So, Sabina, a couple of things real quick, and Rula may have something to add, is that, I think I think bringing people together is that making a conscientious decision to include, as I think one of our wonderful panelists talked about, the fact that, diversity is force. The word, I've always, and it's been said in numerous ways, diversity happens, but inclusion is the choice. So every one of us has an opportunity to make a conscientious decision to include someone that, and we may not be, thinking we're being racist, but by excluding people or not conscientiously including them, that is one action that we as both a community and the programs that we take, the education, reach out to communities that we haven't been able to. And I know we're doing a better and better and better job, but that's something that has to be very conscientious. The other couple of things, and Henry touched on those, is that in regards to your law enforcement, there are quite often, I think 150 in Ohio or across the region beyond Ohio, 150 citizens advisory boards. And so we need independent citizens to be a part of tracking and knowing what are the issues of violence and brutality and injustice that are going on in the law enforcement. And so that's an opportunity for people to raise their hand and volunteer for the community that you live in. We are very engaged as an institution doing cultural competency with law enforcement and welcome any law enforcement entity to approach us. And in a very professional and systematic way, we're able to engage with them. The last thing I want to mention is that, there's a lot of injustice in sentencing. Henry alluded to this, and we've seen this, Rola has seen in the work that she does, is that there is a need for court observers and again, tracking in our judicial sentencing as to how African Americans are treated versus the rest of society. Just Mercy had, obviously one set of examples, but it happens every day in our own backyard. And so those are concrete opportunities for people to learn about and get physically engaged in.
Thank you. Rula, were you about to say something? I saw.
Just a +1 to everything Shakila said. And another thing we can all do is make sure that in the effort of including individuals, that includes volunteer organizations, boards that we serve on, making sure that our community is properly represented in leadership roles so that all of the voices are at the table when issues are happening and decisions are being made.
And I can see Shakila smile because
yeah,
that's
the words
all about.
There it is.
So I just wanted to add that Brother Issa did post that the ICGC youth group is putting together action items specific to the youth. So if anyone has any ideas, please send them to Issa Razi or Ms. Malik, the other youth coordinator, inshallah. So with that, unless we have any other thoughts, I would once again like to thank everybody who came. I hope this program was of benefit. I hope, inshallah, this program is one of many to come. I look forward to the meal at Tony's house, inshallah. And inshallah, thank you again. I've learned so much from all of you, and for you all to take the time to do this is really something I hope Allah puts in your books of good deeds. So thank you, and Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you.